Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's gardening time. It's my favorite time of the week. I say that every week. And just like the last couple of weeks, we've got a great show in store for you. Wonderful guests today. Before we get into that, I want to go ahead and give a shout out to Francois in Quebec and Pam in South Africa and Baby Root. I'm glad that you're able to join us here as well from Nevada. You may not know that I grew up in Sparks, Nevada, and Reno back and forth over the years. And my early life, I was a Nevadan, and at heart, I still am in many ways. So nice to see you all here. We've got both Heidi and Jay. Great to have you back for the moderator expertise that they add and make this such a wonderful show. And then so many others that I see a few new people and a lot of the regulars. And so let's not take any more time and get right into our show with Nate, the Viking. And for those of you who don't know, I've got a link in the description below from the Garden Like a Viking channel. So Nate, welcome. How are you?
Very well. Thank you. Good to be here.
And so I think you look a bit Nordic, and you tend to have that Viking persona. Your thumbnail on your channel is the gruff berserker kind of a look. But you're such a nice guy, and you know so much about gardening. So tell us a little bit about your channel and how you came to garden like a Viking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so I about 14 years ago now, I left my hometown and I went traveling throughout the world. And when I was traveling, I spent a lot of time in Sri Lanka and Asia, in India and Nepal, Southeast Asia, and
Wow.
spent a lot of times in villages, and learning these ways of living from people that their lives depend on it. It's not like a hobby garden, and so got to learn a lot of things from a lot of different people, and just kept experimenting for several years, or experiencing, and then I came to I came into the situation where I got involved in the cannabis industry in Northern California. And that's when it all really took off, is when I started living in the mountains there, and I started becoming a full-time grower there, learning all the tips and techniques and methods. And those people in that world really are pushing the bounds. They're really like into it. It's real high stakes kind of gardening is what I called it. And so, just kind of worked my way up the ladder there, and then became the head grower on a medium-sized commercial farm, and had a lot of responsibility on my shoulders. And so that was an intense learning ground. And then when that all sort of collapsed, when it sort of when the bottom fell out, and I left that life behind, then I was like, okay, well, I've got all these skills that I developed in the trenches. Now what do I do with them? So I said, hey, I should start a YouTube channel. And it just kind of took off from there.
And I and many others are glad that you did. And so, for those of you who don't know, and I see a lot of the names, some of your followers are checking in as well today. Nate and I did this just a couple days ago. So I was a guest on Garden Like a Viking doing this same kind of chat. And this is kind of part two. So we'll build a little bit on that. And I encourage you to go ahead and check out Nate's channel, and then check out that most recent live stream, because I think it was a really good chat. We covered a lot of things. We realized that we have a lot of similarities in our philosophies, in how we grow. And one of the things I really want to focus on today, even with those similarities, one of the things I really like about you and your channel is the scientific approach you take. Now, I love research-based information. I love the science behind gardening, but maybe because of this background you just told us, you are doing a lot of active research and experimentation in your garden and in your grow room. And so why don't you share a little bit from a philosophical and from a scientific viewpoint of why you like that approach to your gardening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Primarily because of the school that I was trained in. You know, where I found my passion for growing was we had a really golden opportunity in the sense that everything that we adjusted, you could actually measure based upon weight and things like that. Okay, so you could actually measure all the inputs, the outputs, and the different things that happen to the plants. And so I really got into the framework of mind of the objective being to grow the highest quality plants possible, just the highest quality. And so that really became my objective. And then learning the different techniques and seeing that these techniques, you know, like Korean natural farming or the Jaedam techniques or unnamed techniques that these villagers have been doing for a long time, they didn't read them in any scientific book. They just developed them over time, you know, and they experiment and they find new ways of doing things that are effective. And so for me, it's important. It's mostly important to go when I say something that I put my stamp on and I say yes, and I give advice. I have to know that that's actually the case. I have to know that that's actually effective. Or instead of I just heard it on YouTube one day from some guy and I'm going to repeat it like it's a fact, you know. So for me, it's a proving ground, you know, because I already know that I could grow a perfectly nutrient dense, thriving garden with any of these techniques, you know. So it's my thing to kind of push the upper limit, push the bounds of it all. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And so there's some really important lessons there for new gardeners, I think, but particularly for experienced gardeners. And I'd been gardening for a couple of decades. We chatted briefly on Saturday about the school garden that I built and ran, 105 raised beds, growing thousands of pounds of food. And I did the same kind of thing. That was really my first exposure to essentially a medium-sized commercial garden. And it was the documentation and the research and the experimentation. So I was working with students, and it helps when you're in a school, you can assign a project to students to keep track of what they're doing. But I found that each of my beds was numbered and I had spreadsheets, and I was able to keep track of what was growing in the bed from one year to the next and how many pounds of produce it was growing. And when I started growing at that kind of level, taking my gardening to that data collection, it became so apparent when something was going wrong, and more importantly, when things were going right. And so I talk a lot about the garden journal and documentation for average gardeners, but I think this is really a good point. And so when we move to that documentation phase, how do you document these things you're doing besides just looking out and saying, oh, my garden is wonderful and it's beautiful?
That's a great question. So there's multiple different levels to that because you know, and I tell my viewers all the time that my firsthand experience will not necessarily jive with the scientific literature, you know. So, and just because it's in the scientific literature doesn't mean that that it's automatically true. I say, well, that's not my experience, or that is my experience. So experience is the number one factor that I use to judge all of this. And so in the beginning, it was measuring everything down to the gram, of course. So it was all about weight. It was all about maximum weight. So you can do the things and you could tell within a couple of months how effective everything was. So we keep track of all of that, of course, all of the numbers. But then when I get, over the years, that has become distilled. I don't actually keep numbers anymore, like on a spreadsheet, because it's now about understanding what the plants need and then giving it to them. And so the number one criteria is to have the healthiest plants possible the whole way through. And so if you do that, if you understand how to read the plants and you learn about what the plant's telling you That's the most important thing, is how to read the plants. And if you can look at the plant and you can say, okay, that's a very happy plant, all right, and then it doesn't really matter. The other stuff doesn't matter as much, anymore. So you've done the practices, you've done the techniques, you understand that the plant is an expression of the soil, and you understand that everything comes down to the soil and how to nourish and nurture the soil, then anything that you put in there is going to thrive. And so it's really looking at the plants and reading them. That's my number one objective now. Of course, harvest definitely comes into play, but it's all become distilled now. So one way that I tell is in my health, my abounding health, because I eat what I consume. A big part of it, of what I consume, is I grow myself. And so I feel as nutrient dense as my crops. I feel thriving.
Nice.
And so that's really what it's all about to me, is are you thriving? Are your plants thriving? Is everything healthy? That's the number one factor.
Good. I'm glad you said that. And we touched on that a little bit when we were chatting, that I talk to my plants and I listen to my plants. And I say that all the time, that they will tell you when they're happy, and they will definitely tell you when they're not happy. So that's good. I like that. Let me go ahead and just broach this subject briefly. I'm Just Stardust, says Gardner Scott, you have a big bruise on your head. Hope you're okay, sir. I am okay. And so, my loyal followers over many years know that a couple years ago I did a video about skin cancer, and I followed my progress, and I took you to one of my appointments and introduced you to my doctor, and that's what happened last week. So it was time for my semi-annual checkup, and he found a spot that he was concerned about. And so had to slice off some of my skin to do a biopsy. It's no big deal. I've had many of these micro surgeries to take care of my skin cancers. That's why I also have videos where I talk about wearing hats and protection when you're outside, so that you can avoid some of those issues. So thank you for asking. I appreciate it, but there's no concern. It's just I'm not the kind to put makeup over my wounds. It's wearing the battle scars to maybe serve as a bit of a lesson, because it is one of those things that we all do need to protect ourselves. So back to the show. Gina's asking, commercial growers in the Emerald Triangle tend not to be organic. How did you grow your cannabis? And this is a great question, I think, because here in Colorado, with the cannabis industry as well, so much of it uses the fertilizers and all kinds of different chemicals. So how did you approach, and this I'm sure holds true with much of how you garden overall, but how do you approach your growing?
Right. So that's a fantastic question, and very true. So I was very fortunate to have the opportunity to work on many different farms in the beginning. And so I saw all these different ways of doing things, and their various effectiveness. And then I ended up for a 4-year stint as the head grower on a medium-sized commercial operation, and we had both. We were able to do one section, a certain number of greenhouses were what we call conventional or commercial, and then we had the sort of elite, the organic, section of it, and they were completely divided. So I had like a golden opportunity to experiment, to learn the differences between these things. And so when and there's such stark differences in the weight, in the effect. At that time in my life, I was still consuming the plant. It's been many years now since I have, but that plant has run its course in my life. But it taught me so many things at that time, and one of them is the effect of organic versus chemical. The chemically grown stuff has a short-circuiting kind of chemical sort of effect, whereas the organic stuff was always smooth and mellow and earthy and grounded. It was dramatic difference. And so we had people that would pay a premium for the organic stuff, of course. But then the testing started coming into it. Then you had to take your stuff to a center and get it tested. And so we were kind of forced into going particular ways. That was towards the end. But the so I've done both, and so I know the strengths and weaknesses of both. I also know the techniques of both, you know. And so that's why in my home garden, 100% chemical free. I mean, 100% organic, because it actually produces a far superior result. The chemicals produce more weight. There's no denying that. And I'm talking for any vegetable, or you know, any growing.
Yeah.
You know, and so the chemicals will produce more weight and more market. You know, when the judge is how much weight, when everything's sold by weight, even at the store, you know, sold by weight, when that's the criteria, that's what's going to be, you know, most important. But if quality was the most important, nutrient density was the most important, flavor was the most important, that's what we would all be moving towards. And for that, there's nothing finer than organics. There's nothing finer.
And I agree. You know, just in the home garden, you see the same difference. You can grow the same variety of plant, and if you're using petro-based fertilizers versus a nice, rich, deep organic soil, you can see the difference in the plants, and I think taste the difference in the roots or the fruits or whatever it is that you happen to be growing. So, yeah, I'm proud to be an organic grower, and I think it makes a big difference.
Yes, and it's once you start using chemicals, you have to, once you go down that road, that's it. Your soil becomes sterile. So a couple of times we tried to do both. You know, okay, well, we're going to use chemicals and organic, and it was a disaster every time, because one relies on the soil food web to provide nutrients, nutrient cycling. The bacteria and the fungi eat it first, and then the protozoa, the nematodes eat all that. And every step along the way, of course, as your viewers know, nutrients become unlocked. But the chemical form is already in a chemical form that bypasses that whole web of life. And so they don't get any food, they die off. That whole web of life dies off. And so once you start the chemicals, that's it. Your soil's addicted. Your plants are addicted. You know, whereas
I'm sorry, I was just going to say that's a great way to say it. That your plants, I say it's like cotton candy with little kids. They become addicted to it.
Yeah, absolutely. They become addicted to it. Whereas the organics is like eating whole foods in their natural state. You know, the plants aren't addicted to it. The soil's not addicted. It's like it's relatively self-sustaining. Just keep giving them what they want, and the soil will self-sustain. It all is a web. You know, the soil food web is doing your work for you instead of the chemical way, which is just completely different and far inferior in every other way except for total weight.
Okay, yeah. Good to know. So it kind of ties in with what John is saying here. My pH is low. I'm thinking I need lime sooner the better, and don't wait for planting season. And we talked a little bit about when we like to, you and I, develop our soils by getting that head start, by doing it months in advance, by letting the soil food web do its job. And so how do you approach pH balancing of your soil, and when do you do it?
Okay, it's going to be a little unconventional probably, but this just comes from my life experience. This just comes from my life experience. So when you're using chemicals and you chemical farm, you're using Miracle Grow and you're using various other things, pH is very important because you have to manipulate it. And if things aren't in the right pH form, then they can't be absorbed by the plant. But in totally natural gardening, the plant actually can select based upon what sugars it decides to exude into the soil. It can select the exact appropriate types of microorganisms that it knows will produce the desired pH results around the rhizosphere. So the only thing that actually matters is the pH around the rhizosphere. It doesn't matter what the pH is 10 feet over that way or even 5 inches over that way. It matters the rhizosphere. And the plants can actually manipulate that themselves if they have everything that they need, meaning a thriving soil food web and microorganisms. And so with that understanding, I never pH my soil. I never pH the organic soil. I just make sure that it's bursting with life, and the plants and the life will take care of itself. And that's because people run into issues when they start trying to play chemist with their soil, because they take a page out of industrial agriculture's book. And industrial ag, yes, you have to manipulate the pH. And so they think, well, then I need to manipulate the pH. You don't.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's my approach as well. By putting the organics into the soil, doing the regular amending, you will create a close to neutral pH, regardless of whether you're starting with acidic. I have an alkaline soil here in my part of Colorado, and that's what I have found not only in practice, but there's also studies that support it as well. That I'll start with a 7.2 or 7.5 pH, and by just adding organic matter to the soil, within a few years, the soil is a 6.5 or 6.8 pH. So, and each of those whole numbers, for those of you who don't know, it becomes a factor of 10. And so, a difference of 7.5 to 6.8 is dramatic, especially when you can get there from just using organics and letting the soil life and the plants make it all work for you. Now, the only time, because I do have a video where I talk about it, the only time that I do use sulfur in particular, I don't use lime in any of my potting mixes or anything, but is when I grow in pots. When I grow in a container where the soil life isn't there yet, because it's a container, it's smaller, and I want more of a jump start, then I'll use sulfur to lower the pH, like to grow my blueberries. But other than that, no, completely agree with you. I think it's all about the soil and the life, and that really makes a big difference. Sarah's wondering, can you please give me advice on how to organically get rid of subterranean pests that destroyed my squash plants in one of my raised beds last summer? Thank you. Now, my approach to this is always find out what the pest is. Find out specifically the pest, and then learn more about its life cycle. So a subterranean pest is usually an adult that lays an egg either on a plant or close to the surface of the soil, and then that larva burrows into the soil. And then the larva spends the winter in the soil, and then it'll crawl back up and devastate the plant once the weather warms up. And so when you learn about the lifestyle of subterranean insects, you can learn how to disrupt that life cycle, either by messing up the soil, by digging it up and pulling out all the little grubs, whatever it happens to be. But that's my approach, is to take an organic approach and don't add anything that will kill at any phase of their life. Just keep them from growing in the first place. And then, one of the big reasons I like raised beds as well is because you can segregate the beds so that when you find a pest like that, you can cover it with an insect fabric and keep those pests inside over the course of the season so that they can't grow into adults and spread to the rest of your garden. Or you can keep other insects from coming into your bed in the first place. But it's developing that knowledge of insects, which is really my preferred approach. How would you look at it?
That's a really good response, and that's pretty much what I would say as well. Without knowing exactly, for some reason when they said subterranean pests, I thought they were talking about like voles or something, not like tiny little things. But either way, if it is a larger pest, there is no denying the amazing impact of cats in the garden. Cats are really destructive in certain ways, but they're not trying to eat the plants like voles and chipmunks and mice and rats. And I had all that stuff here because we're in the city. This is like not dense city, but we're in the city. And so there's rats and there's all that kind of stuff. And once I got the cat, just having the scent of the cat totally transformed. I don't see any chipmunks or any of that kind of stuff. No mice anymore at all. So that's the thing for those kind of critters. And for the other kind of critters, definitely understand their life cycle and understand that, now I don't know how you feel about this, but understand their life cycle, and that if they have the larval stage, okay, if they're a caterpillar of some kind, or then you can use BT. I mean, I do
Oh, sure.
use BT with profound success. The past handful of years, past couple of years especially, I was resistant to it for a long time because I was like, I don't need that. I don't want to put anything on it that, I don't understand its effects. What if it sets off a chain reaction where everything dies? And, but then I educated myself and I experimented with it, and the BT is very effective for that. So
that's a good suggestion. And for those of you that don't know BT, it's Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria, actually a family of bacteria that target very specific insect pests. And so you can get different type of BT. I use BT in some of my water features for the larva that can grow, mosquito larvae in particular. And you can get BT for all kinds of different pests. And then also briefly, I had assumed the question was about an insect, but in all of my beds, I've got metal mesh under my beds to keep those burrowing pests from getting into the beds. So, so it's been pointed out, Nate. I don't know if you can lock your focus, but the focus of your camera is kind of going in and out, and so the background and your face are kind of weaving back and forth a little bit for some of the viewers.
I saw that. I thought that was you doing that. I've never seen that before. So whoops.
Yeah, it could just be the automatic focus versus a fixed focus. It looks like that could be better, but we'll see how that works. So
hold on 1 second.
Whoops. No problem. So, okay, I'll go ahead and scroll through and see if I can find another good question. And so Brian is asking, I have a question. If you get a forever chemical in your garden, how do you get rid of it? And so, this is one of those, for the most part, I just acknowledge that there are forever chemicals everywhere, and you can't really get rid of them unless you want to replace your soil, unless you want to completely start from scratch. But and Nate talked a little bit about this when we were talking about the pH. The bacterial world in particular is amazing. And so the microplastics, I haven't seen any research on this yet, but I know it's being done. There are bacterias that in different regions or in different applications will eat everything we think is terrible. I mean, there's bacteria that deals with plastic, and there's bacteria that deals with pests, and there's bacteria that deals with radiation. I mean, there's all kinds of bacteria. And so I kind of operate under the assumption that if I continue to add organic matter to my soil, I don't really have to worry too much about these forever chemicals, because the plants and the soil life are going to take care of each other, and they're going to kind of push out any of these interlopers, any of these intruders that could pose a problem. So you're nodding your head. What do you think, Nate?
That all is, again, I second all of that. And also, I feel like we have to understand what forever chemicals are we talking about, because there's a lot of talk now about the forever chemicals and things, and to a degree you have to understand that we live in a civilization that is immersed in these forever chemicals, and so you're going to really drive yourself insane trying to worry about every tiny little chemical that might be in the soil. There's kind of no escaping it. Okay, so to one degree we have to say, okay, now, how much of this is under my control? The chemtrails, I get a lot of chemtrail questions and stuff. Well, how much of that is under your control? None whatsoever. And so the thing that I recommend to do is to build resilient systems to focus on the soil food web, and then to also understand deeply how the plants work. That just because something is in the soil does not mean that the plant is going to take it up.
That's right.
And you have to understand by what, like plastics and certain things, you have to understand by what mechanism, how would the plant even take this up? The plant, there's so many things in the soil that the plant doesn't take up because it doesn't need it. And there's no mechanism by which it's developed to uptake that into the soil. So just because there might be some kind of chemical present, you don't have to be really that concerned that it's guaranteed to be in your food and then in your body. So it's keeping it in perspective, keeping the soil life happening, and everything will be just fine.
I completely agree. And that leads us to Bud's question. Please ask the Viking, what are the key things we can do besides adding compost to promote the food web in our soil?
Yeah, wonderful question. And many things. And so really, it's you take a step back and you understand what the job of the grower actually is. And so many people think it's growing plants, but your job actually is cultivating microbes in the soil. Your job is actually a soil cultivator. And so when you take the step back and you say, okay, so let us instead focus on the soil and what needs to go into the soil. And then the plant is an expression of the soil. So a healthy soil microbiome, the plant will be healthy. I mean, with very few exceptions, the plant will be healthy. And so when we can take a step back and reframe the job of the gardener as a soil farmer, then we can say, okay, what do I need to do? We need to keep organic matter high in the soil. We need to keep it good quality organic matter high. Got to give the microbes something to eat. We got to give them a home. We can use different manures. We can use different, you could also use dry amendments, alfalfa meal, bone meal, blood meal. Those are all organic matter as well. You can use leaf mold. You can use any of the organic matter things that we commonly talk about. Now, we can have that in the soil present so that the microbes have something to eat. Then we always keep the soil covered, always, because the ultraviolet radiation will destroy microorganisms. And if you look to nature, for the most part, where things are growing, there's never bare earth. There's never, nature does not like just scraped apart ground. Yet that's how the industrial ag system does it. It just scrapes the earth clean, leaves it tilled and exposed to the elements all winter long, and no microorganism food, nothing. And then they have to dump chemicals on it. So for us, it's about cultivating those microorganisms. So once you get the organic matter in there, once you get the aeration happening in the soil, you have to make sure that your soil structure is appropriate. Okay, you have to make sure that it's not bogged down, that it's not soggy, that it's got airflow. Okay, if you water or if it rains and that water sits there and you're just looking at standing water at any point, that's a sign that your soil's compacted, and that you will want to get that air happening in the soil. So when we have organic matter, we got good aeration in the soil through various different techniques. Then we can use things like aerated compost tea. I'm a huge proponent of good quality aerated compost tea. And my channel has like 40 different homemade fertilizer recipes because...
Yeah, you've got a lot of information. And I wanted to talk about this. So I'll let you finish your thought here, and then I have a question I want to ask.
Oh, yeah, yep. And so really, but the one that you need to focus on the most is the aerated compost tea. And getting, but none of that is going to matter until you, whoops, did I freeze up?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay. But none of that is going to matter until you get the home for the microorganisms. So because the soil wants to be at capacity. It always wants to be at its carrying capacity as far as microorganisms go. So but if you just have straight up clay and you're not paying attention to it, you don't got organic matter in there, it's kind of compacted. Adding the compost tea or the fish fertilizer that I show you guys how to make isn't going to make that big of a difference. What's going to make the most difference is getting those factors, getting the home for the microorganisms set up first, and then populate the home with the aerated compost teas and things, getting that in there. So, and you will have massive success doing it that way.
Yeah. And so what I want to talk about next, and I'm guilty of this, most people that are making videos on YouTube for gardeners are guilty of this. The problem is I know the difference and I shouldn't be making the same mistakes. But for those of you that heard what Nate just said, he was very specific to talk about aerated compost teas. And so I'll talk about making a compost tea, and I'll talk about making some of my weed teas and the comfrey tea, and that's partly just because I think for a lot of people that's easier to understand a common terminology. But when I talk about compost tea and I talk about uh, the the weed tea and all of my different teas, I'm really talking about an extract. I'm talking about taking a plant material and soaking it in water and then using that water in on my soil for my plants. And many people are using teas thinking it's a tea. And when they hear about a compost tea, all they know to do is soak it in water, and they're actually using a compost extract. And so I know you know better than most the difference between the teas and the extracts and how they're used. So would you take a few minutes to explain that difference and how you approach it in your garden, why you will use a tea for some things and why you'll use an extract for other things?
Yes, very good question. Very common question and misunderstanding. So essentially, there are three types of fertilizers that we would use. And the simplest would be the extract. And then it is the anaerobic fermentations. And then it would be the aerated compost teas. So there are three distinct different classes. And they have different strengths and weaknesses. So the anaerobic fermentations, that's the things like and I've got a lot of those on my channel as well. That's where you put all the J-Dom style stuff. Those are anaerobic fermentations. We put the weeds, or we put the crop residue, or we put the manures or whatever it is into the barrel. We put the water in there. We add some leaf mold for that local biology to get in there, and then we let it ferment. We let it ferment for quite some time, and it goes through all kinds of weeks and months, several months, and we just keep it in the barrel, and it goes through all kinds of different stages, and it smells, and all kinds of molds and stuff, soldier fly larvae, all that stuff, and it's all good because those microorganisms are consuming the materials that you've added, and they are making it through their process plant available. Okay, now that is good for nutrients. So we have to understand the difference between a nutrient solution and a microbial solution. So a nutrient solution is something that's going to give like N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. It's going to give those elements, and that's what it primarily does. So extracts are really good for that, and anaerobic fermentations can be really good for that as well. But whereas the aerated compost teas is much more about the biology, and so it's very low in the NP and K. But if you've got the soil right, if you've done your base work, meaning you got the nutrients in the soil, the organic matter, then you don't really need a whole lot of additional NPK. You need that to make sure that the microbial life is topped off so that they can cycle the nutrients for you. So they're very different things. And the extract is a quick kind of a combination. The extract, and I show how to make a seedling fertilizer on my channel that's very effective, organic seedling fertilizer out of just compost extract, and if you have it, some worm castings. And we just basically just put it into a paint strainer, a mesh bag, and flush it around, in the water, and boom, it's right there. Whatever falls off of the substance, NP and K stuff, also the microorganisms will fall off in there. Yes. Now, the aerated compost tea then takes essentially an extract and then adds air and a food source for those microbes. So we literally are taking compost and then creating in a 55-gallon drum or a 5-gallon bucket, depending on the size of your garden, we are creating liquid compost because we're adding air and a food source. Those two things we talked about earlier, we're adding that into the solution. So it multiplies the microorganisms. And in ideal conditions, these microorganisms in the compost will double their population every 20 minutes.
Yeah,
So
that's incredible.
it's exponential growth. So in just 24 hours, now you've got a 55-gallon drum full of liquid compost that smells inviting. It smells full of life. And you dilute that properly. You put that, shower it over the plants, and the plants just sing. I mean, they just love it. So that's in a nutshell. You know, there's a lot more to it, but that's in a nutshell.
And you raise a very important point as well, because, you know, we've talked about listening to our plants, using our plants to tell us what's happening. The bacteria that's involved with all of this will tell us what's happening as well, because when you use that aerator, when you've got the oxygen involved, you're using the aerobic bacteria, and it smells sweet, it smells earthy, it's wonderful. When you put all the stuff in a bucket and close the lid and come back a month later, it smells terrible. And that's the anaerobic bacteria that's telling you it's a different type of decomposition. And so, you know, I'm sure you've had questions as well. You know, I tried to make a tea and it smells terrible. Can I still use it? But all it is a different type of bacteria that has broken down that material to release those nutrients from the compost or whatever you happen to use. And yeah, we call it, you know, my comfrey tea is a fermented liquid that I get the extract after 4 or 5 weeks, and I have to endure that smell. But it's great when I add it to the soil. So yeah, appreciate that that explanation, Nate. And so when we talk about making our own aerated compost tea to get that aerobic bacteria, Serena is asking, does it matter what kind of bubbler is used, or will a fish pump bubbler work?
Hello, Serena. The type of bubbler is actually very important. So a fish tank bubbler can be fine if you have a 5-gallon bucket. But we actually want a considerable amount of air. We don't want it to look like a fish tank where it's just kind of bubbling in there. We want it to really look like it's at a rolling boil. You know, we need that air in there, that aeration in there. Very important. So I've made a couple of videos last year on aerated compost tea, and it's in, well, I've got a Viking storefront on Amazon. The exact ones that I use are there. So there's one for a 55-gallon drum, which it's a commercial. It's only like $50, and it lasts years. So it's like a commercial metal, you know, 1,700 gallons an hour of volume. And then there's a small one for like 5-gallon buckets. If you have a aquarium pump, you can use that. Just keep the volume small, 5-gallon bucket.
Yeah. And I suggest for anyone who hasn't done it before, start with the 5-gallon bucket. You learn a lot. It's so much easier to manage. You know, there's videos out there like on your channel where you're using the drum, and it makes perfect sense if you already have some experience to understand it. But yeah, you know, if you think about it and you actually get to the micro level, each of those bubbles is growing life. And so if you've just got a few bubbles that are bubbling up through the liquid, you're minimizing the amount of life that can be doubling every 20 minutes. Whereas if you've got an infusion of oxygen at all levels, you exponentially are generating that bacterial life. And that really does make an important difference. You touched on this briefly in your explanation. Adam's saying, I use compost extracts as a soil drench. I use compost teas as a foliar spray to help fend off bad organisms. And that's what I do, and that's what you do. So when you say you spray it and the plants love it, talk a little bit about the foliar feeding versus the drenching to encourage that soil life.
Yeah, definitely. So the anaerobic ferments, over the years, personally, in my experience, I found that the anaerobic ferments, I let them go digest all the way. I let them digest completely. I don't actually use them anymore when they still smell that putrid stench of death. So because, well, for just my experience. And so I found that it's best to let those digest fully until the smell kind of goes away and most of the material is digested. And then we apply that to the soil. And that is really good for the soil because it's full of good plant available nutrients. But we don't, there can be pathogenic stuff in those kind of things. So no more do I apply any of the anaerobic ferments to the leaves of the plants, because you're just asking yourself, you're just kind of asking for issues. And I found this over working with lots of people and myself over the years. So so you can apply that to the soil for good food source for microorganisms and things like that. But to the leaves, I only apply the aerated compost teas, and I apply it foliarly. And you'll see that my aerated compost tea has my homemade fish fertilizer in that, and also some of the lactic acid bacteria serum made from milk. I've got videos on my channel about how to make those. I apply some of those things at the end of the brewing process. And then I foliar feed, because it does two things. Well, it does many things, but two primary things. One is it helps to crowd out pathogens. It helps to, the good, beneficial, good smelling aerobic bacteria will sort of occupy the space, more or less, and occupy the food sources to crowd out the competition for the pathogenic bacteria. And I found this to be very effective. Yeah. At suppressing plant diseases and really anything. It's all about just creating the healthiest plant possible. And so that's the one effect of it. But the other effect is that when you foliar spray, plants have developed the ability to absorb certain nutrients through their leaves. And they've co-evolved over the millennia, eons of time with birds and things. And so the droppings from birds, so they've developed this ability to absorb nutrients through their leaves. And this can be very effective in addition to what is in the soil already. And so in particular for things like, if you notice that your tomatoes have blossom end rot. Now, that's several factors. Inconsistent watering is number one, and therefore the calcium is unavailable to the plant, even if it's in the soil. But number two, you can spray with the homemade calcium solution from the eggshells that I have on my channel. And then you can apply that foliarly, and it goes right to the source. It goes right to the source, because calcium's immobile nutrient, which I won't get into here, but so it does many things. Very beneficial.
Yeah, and there's actually research that supports that, the foliar spraying to cut back on some of those potential diseases and some of those potential problems. So I think that's an important aspect when we actually do have research that shows that, yes, that can be effective. And then someone like you who says, I do it and I see the difference. And so let's shift a little bit to a slightly different topic when we start talking about research and things that you're doing in your garden to show whether it works or not, because I love that about your channel. And you knew this was coming. Let's talk electroculture, okay? And so electroculture tends to be the gardening magic bullet or magic wand, so to speak, that a lot of people are just saying it works magic. Now, I'll give a brief background for those of you that may not know about electroculture. It's basically the idea of putting an antenna into your soil. And depending on who you listen to, that antenna attracts different things, be it magnetic waves or electrical waves or cosmic energy. There's lots of different stories. And 150 years ago, there was some research from a few individuals who wrote about it. And that's where it originated, when electricity was still in its infancy as a science and electromagnetism. Since then, however, and it's been about 100 years since any serious paper has been written about electroculture. And so you won't find any research-based information about it. You won't find any scientific support about it. But Nate, you did an important series, more than one video, that talked about how you were going to do it, and you did it in your garden. And tell us about that.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, and a huge question I got, in particular last year. It seems to not really be an issue this year, but so I started seeing this thing about electroculture, and I thought, okay, so it didn't sound right to me. I didn't understand by what mechanism would this actually work. Knowing how the soil food web works and how nutrient cycling is, I'm not seeing how that would do anything to the plants. That was my hypothesis. Okay, and so but what I wanted to find out was, is there even a shred of truth to this? Because I need to know. If there is, I need to know. And so what I did was I went and I got a $120 roll of copper, and I made all these different antennas, and I wound some clockwise because there's so much information on it at the time. You know, it has to be counterclockwise 8 times, and then, but it has to have a fractal, shape up top and things. So I did many different, and it has to be round around wood, or there has to be a quartz crystal. There has to be a quartz crystal, put into one of them. So we did all these things, and I put them all over the garden. All right, my garden, I put them at my mom's garden. I put them at my dad's garden, at the Viking North garden. So a lot of different experiments. And you remember earlier when I told you I've become, if there's one thing I'm an expert at, it's just reading the plants. It's reading the plants. That's what it's all about. And so I can tell how subtle an effect is on a plant. I can tell the difference between adding fish fertilizer to my compost tea and applying it and not adding it. I can tell the difference that subtly in the plants because I spent so much time reading the plants in Northern California. My whole thing was, that's what it was about. And so I've learned to speak the language of the plants. Now, when I did this experimentation, I observed very carefully to see is there any shred of actual effect to any of this. And you can watch the video, of course, but spoiler alert, after 3 months of I felt like 3 months was enough time. Okay. And so I looked and I show you guys in the video some of the experiments, but I didn't have time to go around and get all of them. But I found that there was absolutely zero effect whatsoever. There was none whatsoever. And I would have noticed that along the way. I would have noticed the plants responding differently. I would have noticed certain ones having, all these miraculous claims of electroculture. That you just put the antenna in the ground. I didn't have to add fertilizer. I didn't have no pests or diseases. There's bees all over the place. Okay, those are miraculous claims. Okay, so anytime you hear miraculous claims like that, you need to investigate. And so upon investigation, the whole thing just kind of disintegrated. And with someone that has the background that I do. So I applied that to this miraculous claims, and I found that the zero, none of them hold up whatsoever, which was my original understanding. There's no mechanism by which that would work. And so to kind of finish with that is when people talk now, there are elements of truth to this, though, that harnessing atmospheric energy, yes, but the plant is already doing this. The plant is already the most perfect antenna that could ever be for harnessing atmospheric energy. That's exactly what it's doing in many ways. And so that's one part. But the other part is that the reason that it exploded so much last year, and I was inundated with all these requests about it and all these questions with it, is because it's very sort of Western in the sense that it's like a pill. It's like, well, you don't have to work out or take care of your health. Just take a pill and you'll be healthy. So it's the same kind of thing. If I don't need to worry about soil food web, I don't need to learn how to compost, I don't need to learn about watering appropriately, none of that stuff. Just stick some copper in the ground and call it good. So it's very appealing to those kind of people. So I understand why it took off, but there's no validity whatsoever.
Yeah. And thank you for saying that. And I know you expected some backlash from some of your audience when you said that. And so kudos to you for not only having gone through that whole process and done those experiments, but being willing to say, this is what happens. And so check out those videos that Nate has on his channel. And I just popped it up on the screen, and Jay has given a link to it. because you're out in your garden. You're not just sitting like you are right now telling the results of this. You're actually in your garden showing side by side what was happening with the plants that had antennae and which ones didn't. And it speaks for itself. I didn't realize you did it in so many different locations, so that's even better.
Yes, I did it in different locations because, I wanted to hear the people that said, well, there's that telephone pole thereby, or there's some kind of harmonic frequent, all these different kind of things. So I wanted to just to make sure, because I had to make sure if I'm going to be this firm on my stance, I have to make sure that it's true, that there is actually zero. And so in the video, you'll see that I show you these plants, and I illustrate to you that there's also just natural variation in plants. That some plants planted from the same seed packet or the same saved seeds even just naturally grow much bigger and stronger than the other ones do. That's just the variation. Now, I could attribute that to electroculture, but I know better.
Yeah. Now, one of my great beliefs in gardening, and I've got T-shirts that I wear that say this, that a good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And my belief, what that means is so many of these tips, these magic bullets, the pill that you're talking about, they don't work because that particular thing works. It's because a gardener is always looking for a better way to do things. And if a gardener is going to take the time to wind a copper wire around a stick 8 times counterclockwise and put a crystal on top, chances are they're taking care of their soil. They're watering appropriately. They're listening to their plants. They're choosing varieties that will do well in their area. And now when the plants grow great, they'll attribute it to whatever the magic was. But I attribute it to them being a gardener who wants to do the best for their plants. And so they'll try these different things. It's just not necessarily recognizing who, in this case, the real magic is in the garden. And it's the gardener.
Absolutely. That's spot on. A lot of the effect. Because in the comments section of that video and things, or the several videos, I did have people making miraculous claims. I mean, things that just sound totally made up and stuff. But they would then explain, certain things. But that is what it is that they focus more on the plants, and energy flows where attention goes. That's a saying I live by. Energy flows where attention goes. And so you're watering that plant more. You're making sure the weeds are out of the way. Just the attention is going to give it. You walk through your garden. You give it energy in that way. So absolutely.
So let's continue on with this. I know the question came up on your show and you didn't talk about it, but I'll go ahead and put you on the spot a little bit from Jason to talk about the underculture. And you don't have to spend a lot of time on this.
Yeah, no, it's just my inner circle tribe. We had a little joke when I so the 3 months after the 3 months, because everyone was asking me in the live streams, hey, what's the updates? And I was like, you gotta wait. And then after I made the video, then I could talk about it again. And so I was really venting my frustrations on the whole electroculture thing. And I was like, you know what? We could start our own thing, and we could say, look, here's what you do, okay? But we got to get serious about it. And we got to say, I'm gonna make a video about it. Say, okay, look, for your plants to grow as big as possible, you have to put a pair of underpants directly next to the plant, okay? But they have to be soiled, and they have to be a G-string is the most effective of all of them, okay? And you have to put it high in your front yard. We went and all this, but it's a parody, yes, but it's illustrating how internet absurdities can happen, because we only had that one time, and I hear about it literally all the time. And so things like that can just grow. They can just grow. And that is as mindless as many things. Wrap the crystals around your copper antenna and stuff. Focus on the soil food web.
Exactly. And that's why I just love it when I find a channel like yours, and why I like to share you and your channel with others, because I think there need to be more of us. Another person who fits into this is Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel, who is joining us here today. So good to see you, Tony. And I feel like I'm in good company because you've only had 2 guests on your live stream that you do all the time. And who are those 2 guests?
You and Tony.
There you go.
That's
so
it.
I know I am in good company to be able to say that the 3 of us have had these conversations, because we and many others I've seen in the comments, some other channels that people are highlighting as well. I think that's important, to find those channels that will debunk the myths, that will talk about what works and why it works. And I've been gardening for decades, and I've never gone for that magic fix. It's all about the experience, the journey, the learning step by step. And I think I saw Bowtie Life mention this, where it's a gradual improvement in the garden. And unless you understand those gradients of why your garden is getting better or getting worse, you're really not learning the maximum that you can from gardening. So how long have you, when you're talking about your Northern California beginnings in particular, where you really became focused on plants, but how long have you been on this gardening path to get to the point where you're at right now?
Let's see, it would be 15 years now. Yeah, it would be 15 years. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, where as far as you can see is farmland, but it's a different kind. These farmers aren't actually growing their own food. They're growing, GMO corn and soybeans, and that's pretty much it. And so for miles and miles and miles. So for me, like growing up and things, a garden was like kind of a hobby that people did. Even the farmers didn't grow their own food. And so when I went traveling, though, and I started that in 2009, was when I saw, wow, okay, this is how people have been living for thousands of years in these villages. I mean, I was far out there in things like, in just like National Geographic type villages.
That's cool.
And I got to see the ways of people's lives where their whole life focused around the food. Their activities, their day-to-day activities focused around growing the food, harvesting the food, preparing the food, and eating and sharing the food. Their whole life did. But it wasn't like a drudgery. It was like a communal thing that they all did together. And they didn't have power equipment, but they had 100 villagers. They had people power, and they're out there talking and laughing, and it's just a whole different way of living. And the food is so much. They all looked very healthy, very settled, and so I started observing and thinking, why, what is going on? And so it's all about the food and the quality of it. And so then when I got to Northern California, I was like, it just lit the fire within me, and I was out there for about 10 years.
Okay.
And so it really lit the fire within me for sure.
That's great. And so I personally think I can see some evolution on your channel with your videos, particularly now that you talk a little bit more about your background. And so you started being in the dirt, growing native style, depending on where you happen to be. And that has evolved to making videos, some of your recent videos, where you're actually in the electronic age, quite literally. You're using your par meter to measure the light that hits the individual leaves of your plant. And so I raise this because for the viewers, my viewers and your viewers, everyone who's watching this live stream, to recognize that it doesn't have to be one or the other, and you don't have to necessarily just do what you find worked in the past, that it is an evolution. And so now let's talk about your par meter, actually bringing in devices to measure exactly what's happening with your plants.
Yes, that's a very good observation, and very true as well. And when I came back from the mountains, and I had nothing and no money or anything, and everything was kind of crazy in life, I had to grow food with no money at all. And so that was, so I was growing villager style, and I was doing the things using those techniques and had practiced those techniques in California, of course, but things that I had seen growing out of trash bags and stuff like that, just using the compost and things. So that's one way, when your limiting factor is cost, when the overall arching factor is the lowest possible cost, then that's the techniques. And that's how the channel sort of started, was when I was in that mode as well. But as it has progressed, and I've sort of built a profession now out of this, and there's more money to experiment with and to do things. Now I am sort of evolving back to where I was in Northern California, as far as it's not so much about just as dirt cheap, as close to free as possible. It's more about the highest possible quality, and really getting into it in that way again, which is like more my roots from learning. And so I appreciate using different things. We can use tools, and do you need a par meter? No. But what will the par meter teach you? Okay, my meter's over there, but if I had it, it's a meter that you place underneath your lights, okay, and it tells you how many millions of photons per second are reaching this specific area. Okay, I just made a video on it like last week or the week before, and so and I explain what it is. I just find this fascinating and super useful, because we see light, okay, but there's only, out of the total electromagnetic spectrum, there's only a tiny little smear of that we can even see. And there's only a portion of that plants actually utilize for photosynthesis. And so the PAR meter tells us, PAR meter tells us photosynthetically active radiation, meaning how much plant usable light is actually reaching the area, the canopy. I don't know what it's doing. How much plant usable light is actually reaching the canopy. And so what that tells you is that you learn the way that light works. So you can tell by your sunny windowsill, oh yeah, it's plenty bright. You use the PAR meter and you see, oh, whoa, actually there's not much light happening there. And it only happens for a couple hours a day. Maybe that's why all my seed starting was failing when I just put it into the window. But it also tells you, it can also show you indoor grow lights, how the space that you have something from the plant, how that dramatically matters in terms of the intensity of the light. It teaches you this so that you understand, okay, the closer the lights are, the more intense the photosynthetically active radiation. Also, it teaches you the spread of your lights. How far out to the side can you place your plants? So it teaches you how to refine your system, which I just find very useful, so that it's all about developing the most amount of skills possible. That way you can have all these tools in your repertoire. You can understand, well, if I'm having issues, maybe it's the lighting, and you can understand how lighting spread works, how distance works, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a good description of why you do it. So, there's a number of channels, mine included, that, we understand the light, we understand the intensity. And so I talk about seed starting and your seedlings. And I will say in my video, if you're using a fluorescent light, have it, a few inches above the seedlings. If you're using an LED light, you can have it a few inches above the seedling. Raise the light as they grow. And I'll talk about that, understanding exactly what you said. But what you're doing, and I know Tony does the same thing, is you actually take a meter to learn why you keep the light a couple inches above the plant, and why you move it up as the plant grows to be able to get the full coverage. And your video is great. And I encourage people to check out that video as well, because a light over a tray of plants does not give all of those plants the same amount of light. And you show that where you are moving your par meter around and showing that depending on where the light is and where the plant is, they're getting different amounts of light. And the plant will talk to you and tell you, the plants in the middle are growing tall, and the plants on the edges are growing small. It could be purely because of the light.
Yeah, yes. And that is actually the number one problem that I see with indoor seed starting. That's the number one problem, is not enough light, or an incorrect understanding of light. And so people think, well, yeah, I got a light, but they don't realize how weak it is. And then they don't realize you go outside and measure the sun. Wow, the sun, powerful. And the sun doesn't matter how far away the plant is, of course, because it's very far away, the light source. But it can also tell you in Northern California, in that type of growing, the number one problem was too much light. It was way more than they would ever experience, even on the equator, anywhere, even in Death Valley. It was more light than the plant would ever experience. And so you get to understand these things, and then it deepens your understanding of the way that light works. So you can custom tailor it to your specific environment.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on the subject. We can save this for a whole nother day, but understanding for the viewers and gardeners in general, the different light needs of different plants. And so as I start adding fruit trees to my garden, and as I start adding fruit bushes to my garden, I'm very aware of the roots, historical roots of those plants, because there are a lot of plants that are understory plants that come from areas where they are growing underneath trees or tree canopies. And then we want to grow them in our garden, and we put them out in that full sun, because everybody knows you put all of your plants in full sun in your garden, right? And then we don't understand why we can't get these fruit bushes to grow. And it's because we're giving them too much light, because that's not what they want. They actually want some shading. And, the good seed companies will often put on the package some information about the plant to help us out after we start growing it, because some plants will benefit from afternoon shade, and some plants benefit from morning sun. And that's a whole nother level of gardening when you start matching your light with your plants.
Yes. It really helps to understand where these plants come from, at least their ancestors, where they sort of adapted to be. For example, the pothos plant is really unique in the plant world, this type of plant, in the sense that it is one of the few plants that can just kind of, it grows based upon how much of the conditions it's receiving. If it's not getting much light, it just doesn't grow that much. But once it gets good light and good moisture, then it can grow really fast. But if it doesn't get good light, it gets real dim light and not a lot of moisture, it just doesn't grow. It just sits in suspended animation. Whereas the things we grow in our garden, they have to hit a trajectory. They can't have these huge dips. They need to grow, sprout, and then grow, like in a trajectory. They can't just have these huge lulls in their conditions. Otherwise, they die. And so it's really good to know, because these evolved under the jungle canopy. They evolved to reach after the light. And if you've ever been to the jungles, you know that very little light is actually reaching the ground.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so, that's one of the things I love about gardening. There are so many of these roads we can take to find out more information about what it takes to be a good gardener. And, no one will ever know everything they need to know. There's just so much more that they want to learn, and so much more that they need to learn that they don't even know they need to learn it. And so as you are approaching your 2025 growing season, what are some of the things that you've recognized that you don't know, that you want to experiment with, that you want to try? What new is happening in your garden to help you out with that knowledge collection?
What new is happening? It's actually a sort of it's a reinvigorating of the techniques, a little bit more of the style of growing in Northern California for this place, because
you're in Indiana. I don't know if we had mentioned that previously.
Right. I'm in Northern Indiana. right near the border of Ohio and Michigan, right in that corner. And so the climate, you know, the conditions are very different than they were, you know, in Northern California, where I really got my skills finally honed. And so to come back, I've had to learn many things, you know, many things in particular about watering and stuff like that. Because in the mountains, if you didn't water, then there was no plants. You had to irrigate because it didn't rain for 6 months during the growing season. Here, like historically, we rely on the rain. It rains enough. But it hasn't. It has been mega drought. The past 3 years has been horrendous. And so I did a total garden renovation, which is actually what my next video in a couple of days is going to be about. A total garden renovation in the fall time, and put beds in. And now I'll be installing drip lines in the style of what I was doing there in California. So it's really seeing what that, and it's amazing since I went from in the ground with just kind of a little bit defined beds using logs and stuff, but mostly just chaotic. It was very, if you look at my old videos, it was very chaotic, bursting with life, but chaotic. But now that I've put the raised beds, it feels like my real estate has increased by like 40%. My real estate as far as area to grow things. I don't know why. It's just now that everything is well defined and up off the ground, it just seems like there's so much more room to grow stuff. So I'm very excited for that.
Good. That actually ties in with what Karen at A Garden for All Seasons is saying. Looking at wooded lake property in Tennessee, lots of questions. Hoping I can use the existing soil amended with nearby naturally composting material. Can I use the trees I have to take down to build beds? And I actually talk about this, Karen, in my book that's coming out on Saturday, Gardener Scott's Guide to Raised Bed Gardening. That yes, absolutely, you can use the trees to in many different aspects of your bed. So I use big thick branches and logs as the sides of raised beds, because as Nate was just talking about, you don't have to do this. You can grow in the ground and learn from it, but learning to raise it up really does give you more room to grow. And so you can use those trees to create some taller beds. And then if you build raised beds, you can use the tree material actually to help fill the base of the beds and break down into the good soil. So let's talk with you, Nate, about that kind of that middle section about amending with nearby naturally composting material. So how do you approach the taking what you already have on your property or that you have access to when you want to create the soil food web and really get things growing well?
Yeah, a fantastic question. So when I came back from the mountains and I got this place, it was just a huge, it's for being in the city, it's a massive lot. And so for being, and it was just grass, and it had been mowed for 100 years. This house is 100 years old today, or this year. So it was just mowed grass for 100 years, very little life, just a flat grass. Okay. So I knew from my experience that the first thing I had to do was get the microorganisms happening, get the diversity of life happening, because just mowed grass probably had chemicals on it and stuff. That's not going to provide the diversity that I need in my thriving garden. So what I did was I went to my parents' house. They have an 18-acre wood behind the house that is very old. And so I was able to gather logs that were partially just started in various stages of decomposition, and they were full of this microorganisms. And so I took those logs, and it was a lot of work, but not a problem. I love that kind of work. I was in the woods hauling wood, you know. I put it on my trailer, brought it back here, and I made all the beds and the pathways out of those logs. And that helped to introduce the microorganisms that I needed into the garden. And then from that same woods, I went to the oldest, biggest trees in the area, and there's plenty. And I got some bags of some of the leaf mold that was around the ground to get that local biology happening. And I took it and I shook it in to each bed that was lined with the partially various decomposition stages logs. And that got that biology skyrocketing, because because there would have been none in there otherwise from the previous 100 years. But now I got those locally adapted thriving microorganisms, and right away everything just took off.
That's awesome. And yeah, that's important. I thought about it earlier when you were talking about uh, that the plant above ground is just the demonstration of what's happening below ground. That it's all happening below ground. That's really most important. And at the time, and it fits in with what you're talking about now, I had the thought that some of my favorite moments in my garden in recent years has been when I've seen the mushroom pop up above the soil surface, because the mushroom is just a small part. It's the fruiting body of that mycelial network that's active in the soil. And so what you're doing with the logs is exactly that. You are incorporating all that fungal activity, and it's the balance of the bacterial activity and the fungal activity within your soil. Like you say, it just skyrockets the growth, and everything is important. So I'm glad you said that, because that's a very important concept, especially when you want to use your local woody materials. Get them local and get them in various stages of decomposition, and you will have bacteria and fungal spores and all kinds of things that are happening within your soil.
Yes, and I knew this firsthand from in California, where we would buy, spend lots of money on specific types of microorganisms, mycorrhizal fungi and things like that. Lots of money for real particular types. An EM1, effective microorganism, it's $500 for a 5-gallon thing of that. Okay, and so we would get that. But then the more that I understood about that, the more that I learned about these things and experimented, I saw that I could make microbial solutions out of locally adapted microorganisms from my exact area, already adapted to my exact climate conditions, drought conditions. They're already adapted to all that, as opposed for free, virtually, as opposed to spending thousands on microorganisms that were cultured in a laboratory in Brazil somewhere.
Exactly.
And so it was actually not only way cheaper, but much more effective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I talk about this in a few of my videos, and I've talked about it on my live streams as well. I'm not an advocate of buying whatever it is from another state, another country, another region. You in Indiana and I in Colorado have similar climates and weather patterns, but there's no guarantee that if I were to take some of your decomposed wood or some of your soil and bring it back to my garden, that any of that life would survive either my winters or my summer, or the pH within the soil, or the food that I'm giving it. It really is a localized activity when you're trying to get the best soil life. And by incorporating something that for $500, it's a great idea, but it could all die within the first month because your system is different than the system where they harvested all of that material.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly what was happening, because at that time we were into the microscopes. We had the books Teeming with Microbes, Teeming with Nutrients, the Jeff books. We had all, so we were following that kind of thing. And we would look at these things under the microscope, and we would see that's exactly what happened when you are using tapen roots and EM1. The microorganisms die, very rapidly, because that's not where they're meant to live. And so that's kind of part of it. You have to continually keep adding them and keep buying them, whereas the local ones already know how to thrive.
Yeah. Yeah. And they'll go dormant in the winter, or they'll die and send out a spore or whatever it happens to be. But yeah, you all can do this very localized with just a little bit of help. And that's where Nate's channel comes in. If you joined us late, Nate is from the Garden Like a Viking channel and has some great videos that really do explain how you can do it locally. And even though you spend money on par meters and other things, you do a lot to show how gardeners can do these things in very cost-effective ways with the materials that they have at hand. And I think you do it in a very effective manner. So we're getting closer to the end of the show. How would you like to spread the message or your big philosophies with the garden like a Viking concept for the people that don't know you? What are some of your important lessons for all of us in the garden?
Yes, I would say that it is to begin growing something. No matter how small you might think that it is, you're going to learn how life works on this planet. You're going to learn the cycling of nutrients. You're going to learn where food comes from. And then when you eat that food, and the more of it that you eat, you're going to experience the life force energy that you get from it, the nutrients that you get from it. And it's going to up level your life. And that really is the key for the whole thing. Now, a lot of people love to grow things, and that's, but to me, the growing of the food, it's of course my passion. I love it, but that's not the end in itself. It's a means to the end, which is nutrient-rich food for me and my family to thrive, to be healthy, to be active, to be feeling good. That's what it's all about. And the more of your own food that you can grow, or if you can't grow it, then formulate the relationship with the people directly that do grow it. Okay. Yeah. And so the more of that you can do, the more you're going to thrive. That's just that, because it comes down to what you put in your mouth and what goes into your body. Is it the dead, depleted stuff from the store, or is it the nutrient rich stuff you grow yourself that's bursting with life?
Yeah.
So
thank you. That's well said. And go ahead.
Oh, and I was just going to finish that. You're right. It does not take a lot of money to do these things. It just takes a minimal. You can really maximize your space with little amounts of money, or you can invest more. It all depends how deep you want to go into it. But for me, I'm an avid cooker. I cook from scratch every single day, and nice. And so it's a huge part of my life, like I observed in the villagers, a big part of their life. So the growing of the food, the preserving, and then the cooking and eating and sharing it is all really big. So I say that I cook from scratch. When I say that, I mean the flavor profile begins in the compost. That's how from scratch I'm talking, is that the flavors, the nutrients literally come from the compost, from the soil. So that's the philosophy.
I'm glad you said that, and that's one of those things I talk about compost a lot, but I don't talk about that aspect that I think you touched on there. So I've been in this house for just over 5 years. I was in my previous house for about 5 years. The house before that was about 3 years. The house before that was about 12 years. And a lot of us do that. We move from house to house. We start gardens, and in many ways we have to learn it all over again because every garden is unique. But at every one of those gardens, and I'm guessing you can guess the answer to this question, as I walked out to figure out where my garden would go, what do you think was the very first thing that I actually did in that garden?
Well, I'm not sure, but I would say you had to look to see where the sun was for one, and then you had
the actual first project, and it ties in with what you were just talking about. The very first thing that I built in every single one of my gardens was the compost bin.
Oh, of course. Yes,
yeah.
Perfect.
Before any beds were in place, before a single seed was planted, it's all about the soil. It's all about making your own compost. And every garden that I've had for 25 years, the compost pile was one of the most important decisions within that garden. And that's, I completely agree with all of your philosophy here, because that's how important I think compost is to a garden, that it needs to be there before the garden is actually there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because you're focusing on the soil. And so many people want to ask about things. What can I do to the plant and stuff after the fact? But you need to focus on the soil first and let the food web do it.
Yeah. So this is fun. So
yeah, this is awesome.
I told you we could just sit and chat about gardening and have a good time. And I can see in the comments, a lot of people have been enjoying this as well. So it was wonderful to have you on. And I've got a link to the channel Garden Like a Viking that that Nate does such a good job with. And so I encourage you all to do that. Jay has been posting a ton of links to your videos and to your channel as well. So I encourage everybody to check that out and become part of the tribe, the Viking tribe. It's a wonderful group of gardeners that are supporting your channel, and I think it's easy to join the Viking tribe. Just go to your channel and check it out, huh? So, final words. What would you like to leave us with?
That's it right there, guys. I mean, you hear it, and just stay loyal to the soil, and you can definitely be a part of the tribe, because we got a great community here that shares knowledge with each other and firsthand experience. We also have a Discord chat. There's a link in the description of my videos. It's free. It's like a chat room for the Viking tribe, and people are sharing firsthand experience, which I love. And I see a ton of people from the tribe in here. And so I really like, and we all know that it's about the firsthand experience. Okay. And so put it to the test and grow something this year.
Awesome. Well, Nate, thank you for being here. It was an absolute pleasure. And I look forward to our next opportunity to chat about gardening.
Absolutely. Anytime. Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Okay. That was fantastic. I'll go ahead and give a shout out to Outlier Gardener. Thank you for supporting the Gardener Scott channel. Thoroughly enjoyed today's live. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed today's live as well. So thank you for saying that. Thank you for supporting the channel. And I've seen some comments as well about my book coming out on Saturday. And some of you know that if it's being ordered online, you probably get it on Monday. You can go to a bookstore and pre-order it, or go to a bookstore starting on Saturday and get it right away. You don't have to wait for the 2 days of mailing because you want to be the first on the block to have the Gardener Scott book. I do not, in answer to some of the questions that have popped up, do not have any book signings set up yet. But when those happen, I'll definitely put them on social media and talk about it in the live streams as well. So I'm excited, looking forward to this book release, and we'll talk more about it next week, hopefully after some of you have seen the book, and you can have it in your hands in the days beyond that as well. So I thank you for all the support. I thank you for all of you who want to explore the world of raised bed gardening. And one of the biggest sections in my book talks about the soil. So based on the conversation I had today with Nate, it should be no surprise that for many of us who are growing successfully, we focus on the soil. And the book talks a lot about different recipes and some of my philosophies with soil. And for that alone, even if you're not growing in a raised bed, I think there's some good information. And I appreciate Nate being here to talk about that as well, because it is so important. I'll be back next week on Monday to do this all over again like we do every week. I look forward to seeing you all here as we continue on our gardening journey. And for the rest of the week, above all, I hope that you enjoy gardening. I'll see you next week.